Okay, Chairman, we are now live.
All right, thank you. Well, welcome to the noon meeting of the House Judiciary Committee. We reserve our Fridays at noon for optional meetings here with the Judiciary Committee, and I suspect in the next week or so, we're going to be working some bills on Friday afternoons because we have a lot of bills out there and our hopper's getting full. But for now, what we're going to do today is hear a report from CSG on justice reinvestment in Wyoming. And you know, the report's going to go into some detail on some history here. And just to give the committee a little bit of an idea of what's happening here, this is a now 2-year-long study that we've been working through in Wyoming. And this study is going to come to an end in the spring, meaning they're going to have collected all the data and analyzed everything they wanted to analyze in the end of the spring. And so during the interim, we're going to receive the full report, the final report, the official report. And then we're going to, most likely, the report's going to, obviously, it's going to come with recommendations on things that we can do. And so the hope is that we get some legislation generated out of this to continue our reinvestment efforts in Wyoming. Right now, the reason why I want to have this report right now is because my committee is very new and new, meaning many of you are new to the legislature. So this keeps coming up in debate as we work other legislation, the efforts of reinvestment and the things that we've done in Wyoming, and it's going to continue to come up. And so I really think it'll be helpful for our committee, our new members, to try to get up to speed a little bit on what we have done, what we've studied, and some of the legislation that's gone through. And I think that will help you on other legislation that's not even, you know, maybe coming out of health, or some of the, you know, the subcommittee on mental health and some of the other areas where this is, well, appropriations even, where it's affected. So that's the intent of today, committee. And with that, we have some presenters, and we can go ahead and admit our CSG team. All right. And this is pretty informal in the way that I want to just hand over the reins and let you guys take it. And committee, we have reserved time at the end of this for questions, but don't hesitate to ask a question during the presentation. If it's, you know, so that you don't have to stack up your questions and worry to remember them in the end. If you want to pause on the slide, let's pause and jump in, and of course there'll be some time in the end. So go ahead and introduce yourselves, and then you just tell me how you want to run the ship.
Thank you, Chairman Olson. Members of the committee, it's nice to speak with you today. I'm excited to be here. My name is Stephanie Durier. I'm a senior policy analyst with the CSG Justice Center. I'm also the state lead for this portion of the implementation phase of justice reinvestment. I've been in Wyoming almost a year now. It is a pleasure to meet all of you. I am joined by my coworker, David Demora. He is a senior policy advisor. I'll let him give a little bit of an explanation and introduction of himself as I set up screen sharing so we can move through our presentation today.
Hi, folks. Pleased to meet you. As Stephanie said, my name is David Demora, and I'm a senior advisor here at the CSG Justice Center. I've been working in Wyoming actually for about 3 years now, both in the first phase of justice reinvestment and in the second phase, which is considered to be the implementation phase. And so I've particularly been focusing in the areas of behavioral health and the intersection of behavioral health and criminal justice. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. But before we get into that, Stephanie is going to give an overview of where we started, what we originally were looking at, what some of the initial assessment was, what some of the past bills are that have been passed, and where we hope to be going in the near future. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you, David. Just as David said, we are going to talk today about justice reinvestment. And let's kick off with a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to cover 4 areas. First, I'm going to provide the committee with a brief introduction to the CSG Justice Center and provide a general explanation of justice reinvestment. Next, I'm going to review for the committee the process and activities carried out during the initial phase of JR, the system analysis and policy development phase. David's then going to take over and present to the committee the work that's been done to complete the assessment of the behavioral health system in the state and the intersection with the criminal justice system as part of the 2019 interim session. And finally, I'll review with the committee how policies passed as part of JR have been implemented in the state and close out with an idea of what next steps may be for providing this committee and other members of the legislature with a full retrospective of JR and data analyses. But before I begin, I want to recognize our coworkers who are not here today with us in the room, so to speak, but have been a vital part of the Wyoming team in this phase of justice reinvestment. So Sarah Friedman is CSG Justice Center's Deputy Program Director who oversees the implementation phase of JR in all of the states that we are working in. Jan De La Cruz is a senior policy analyst and oversaw the subaward contract that was awarded to Wyoming by the Bureau of Justice Assistance to support implementation activities. And finally, I want to recognize Angie Gunter. She is our senior research associate at the CSG Justice Center and has been working closely over the past 2 years to set up data monitoring for JR policies in collaboration with the research manager, Mr. Harris at the Wyoming Department of Corrections. So although David and I are here with you today, we are definitely a strong team in the background supporting us. So a little bit about the Justice Center. We are a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that combines the power of membership association, of which Wyoming is a member, serving state officials in all 3 branches of government with policy and research expertise to develop strategies that increase public safety and strengthen communities. So I think the committee will see how we work, how we brought people together in Wyoming, the amount of stakeholder engagement that we completed. We really drove the criminal justice field forward with research both outside of Wyoming and using Wyoming's own data. And we really built some momentum or helped the state build momentum for some of the policy change through our technical assistance and expert assistance in other areas. So what is justice reinvestment? It's a data-driven approach to improving public safety with the aim of reducing corrections and related criminal justice spending and reinvest those savings in strategies that can decrease crime and reduce recidivism. The Justice Reinvestment Initiative is funded principally by the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA, as they will be known throughout the presentation, with additional funding from the Pew Charitable Trust. Technical assistance for states participating in justice reinvestment is done through us, the CSG Justice Center, as well as through Community Resources for Justices, Crime and Justice Institute. Over the last 15 years, the CSG Justice Center has helped 31 states control corrections spending and reinvest in strategies to increase public safety. So as you can see on this map, we have 27 states that we have been in and 4 that we currently are in: Oregon, Wyoming, Kansas, and Vermont. Across these 31 states, we have estimated to save $3.2 billion in savings or averted savings, reinvested more than $650 million into criminal justice systems, averted prison population growth by almost 70,000 people, and reduced prison populations by more than 18,000 people, successfully leading to the closing of 21 correctional facilities across those states. And justice reinvestment is tailored to the specific needs of the state. So This really rang true in Wyoming. States have used readjustment to tackle many different things. So local public safety and health challenges, from recent crime trends to people with behavioral health needs, that really spoke true in Wyoming. To scale up recidivism reduction efforts, such as increasing the use of risk and needs assessments, the quality of supervision, the access to effective research-based programs and services. Again, you're going to see that we really touched on that in Wyoming around risk and need assessment, the quality of supervision. Enhance data collection, develop analytical capacity, and create a shared understanding of criminal justice issues. This project was mightily served in the first phase of JR through the data collection process the state was already engaging in. And we'll go through that a little bit here as we move along. And then finally, manage costs associated with state prison and local jail population trends to ensure resources are being used effectively. So we'll be able to give you kind of where the state was at with their population trends prior to the start of JR and where we are at closer to today's date. Not up to the date, but at the end of last year, I believe. So how did this process begin in Wyoming? It began in March 2018 when Wyoming leaders requested technical assistance for justice reinvestment. The letter was submitted to BJA and was signed by all three branches of government and support, including Governor Meade, Chief Justice Burke, President of the Senate at the time, Speaker of the House at the time, and DOC Director at the time, Robert Lampert. And under the direction of the Joint Judiciary Committee, CSG Justice Center staff analyzed data and helped the JJC develop policy options to improve Wyoming's criminal justice system. So some of those things that the JJC identified were increases in the length of prison sentences and the length of time served prior to release. The impact that revocations for technical violations while on community supervision was having on the prison population. Understanding what can be done to improve substance use disorder treatment among criminal justice populations, assessing reentry programming that will assist in preparing people to reenter communities and be successful once they reenter, and what alternatives to incarceration would look like in Wyoming. Throughout the first year and second year, the JJC was updated 5 different times on progress in these areas that they originally identified in that letter to BJA. And finally, here in this section, just to give you a brief overview, we're going to dive into this much deeper as we move throughout the presentation, but just to give you a sense of where we've been at in the state. So we started in March 2018 with the letter submitted to BJA. And during that time, we did an in-depth system analysis that we're going to review here in a minute, a policy development, and it resulted in 4 initial pieces of legislation. And then in, February of 2019, that is when David really took a lot of responsibility on and looked at the interim committee's request for further assessment into the behavioral health system in the state and the intersection with the criminal justice system. And that work during the interim resulted in the second round of legislation and HEA 62. And then from March 2019 on, we've really been in an implementation stage with the state to implement the 4 initial pieces of legislation, and now here currently wrapping up the implementation stage with the second round of legislation with the passage of HEA 62. So we've been active in the state for 3 solid years now. We're ending here at the end of March in 2021. And so we will be ready to kind of provide that retrospective of the full 3 years later on a little bit down the line. All right, so if there aren't any questions or David doesn't want to add anything additional, we'll move into the justice reinvestment system analysis and policy development, really giving the committee an overview of that first phase of justice reinvestment, where we were able to do really in-depth analysis that Chairman Olson mentioned in his introduction. All right, we'll keep moving. The Justice Reinvestment System Analysis and Policy Development phase took place approximately March 2018 to March 2019. So you can kind of see some of our bigger bullets here of what was going on during that time. So we had the request for the first phase of Justice Reinvestment. And then in May 2018, we really began the process of doing data analysis and stakeholder engagement across the state that would assist the Joint Judiciary in making policy decisions. During that time, we also participated in the Wyoming Forum on Public Safety, which I'll get to here in just a second, that really introduced us to stakeholders across the state and gave us a great opportunity to hear their voices about the system. And then all of this work culminated in the passage of the initial 4 pieces of legislation. So that Wyoming State Forum on Public Safety, one of the first chances that we had, like I said, to interact with the stakeholders in the state. Over 100 people from across the state traveled to Cheyenne to the day-long Forum on Public Safety. People in attendance included representatives from behavioral health, victim services, field services, the Department of Corrections, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, law enforcement. I'm probably missing a couple of categories there. But it was truly a unique opportunity for CSG to hear from people about how they would like to see the justice and reinvestment analyses take shape, and what topics were important to them, and what they were seeing in the state that really could be addressed through some criminal justice reform work. We didn't stop there though. At the State Forum, we continued throughout that year to meet with over 200 stakeholders to deepen our understanding of the current policy and practice in Wyoming. So we met with stakeholders that truly represented the full spectrum of the criminal justice system, from front-end system pressures like law enforcement, people with lived experience, court officials and state attorneys, to incarcerated populations, both at the folks within the Department of Corrections, as well as staff at the Department of Corrections, parole officials, victim advocates. And then we also focused on behavioral health stakeholders. So those community-based treatment providers, law enforcement officials and officers, victim advocates. So we really tried to collect information, context, and data from across the system. So additionally, in addition to the State Forum and discussions, we also visited 7 different jurisdictions to gain insight into the system. And during those 7 different visits, CSG staff were able to observe supervision contacts between officers and people on probation. They were able to tour the adult community correction centers in Gillette, Casper, and Cheyenne and talk with the staff there. They observed parole board hearings, and they even visited jails and met with sheriffs and their staff, which I do believe was facilitated by Mr. Odekoven. So much thanks to him for that early work in that process of arranging everything for us. And like I alluded to earlier, all of that context, all of those meetings, those conversations were accompanied by an amazing amount of aggregate data, which led to the 1.2 million individual case level records being analyzed from across the state. So as you can see here, this was a collective effort. We received data from the Division of Criminal Investigation, from the Judiciary, from the Department of Corrections, the Attorney General's Office, from the Division of Victim Services, and Department of Health. All were amazing partners in this process of really trying to get a good, solid understanding of the state's criminal justice system and the issues that we're facing in the system. And during that system-wide analysis, CSG Justice Center staff identified 4 key challenges facing the state. And we developed some corresponding policies with those challenges. And I'm going to move you through those challenges now. Please feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions as we move through. But those four challenges were prison and supervision population growth. Wyoming had seen a real increase in the last 10 years in their prison and supervision populations. 2, ineffective and costly responses to supervision violations. 3, inadequate victim assistance and compensation. And 4, inadequate substance use disorder treatment for the criminal justice population. So this first challenge facing Wyoming was a growing prison and supervision population. Probation and parole revocations were constituting over half of all prison admissions at 54%, and 85% of those revocations were attributed to technical violations. So the violations of community supervision. Between fiscal year 2013 and fiscal year 2017, nearly 47% of the felony probation population across the state was supervised at a level higher than their assessed risk level.
Stephanie,
And the average length of,
Hi,
definitely.
this is Art Washit. On the technical violations that you just spoke to, do you have a breakdown on what sorts of technical violations were more common than others?
Definitely. Thank you for the question. Chairman Olson, Representative Washit, I don't have the full breakdown, but we do on hand, but I do have it for you, and I can definitely send that over to you. I do know that the technical violations can range from anything from a violation of curfew to not meeting their officer a certain number of times. It would not, let me put it this way, it would not be a new offense. So not a new arrestable offense or a new conviction, but something that was a violation of the terms of their supervision.
Yeah, thank you. If you can forward that on to you can just copy the whole committee on it. That'd be great. Representative Oakley has a question as well.
Yeah, so is absconsion included in your list of technical violations?
It is, yes. Chairman Olson, Representative Oakley, absconsion is one of those technical violations that would have been counted.
Go ahead, Representative Oakley.
So then what I'm hearing basically is everything that's not a new criminal offense was put under what would be called a technical violation?
Chairman Olson, Representative Oakley, that is correct.
All right, please proceed.
Thank you. Another thing, or another part of this challenge around growing prison and supervision population growth was the average length of probation terms of 4 years. It was really exceeding the period during which most recidivism was occurring, which was at 17 to 21 months, stretching supervision out and putting a strain on programs and resources. Here's a little bit of a breakdown of what we found when we were looking at the prison capacity and the projected growth over the next 5 years. And so at the current rate, Wyoming's prison system was projected to grow by 200 beds by 2023, really pushing the population to 109% of capacity. And this is not including those that were being housed out of state at the time. So the state was really facing a kind of critical mass point with their prison population. Additionally, the state was spending $23 million annually incarcerating people with new commitment nonviolent offenses. And so these would be property offenses and drug offenses. But approximately in fiscal year 2017, new nonviolent prison admissions accounted for 275 people. Their average length of stay at 22 months, with the average monthly cost of prison per person being $3,744, resulted in a $23 million expenditure. Similarly, with Wyoming supervision population, it was expected to grow by 9%, putting additional strain on supervision resources. To give you an idea, that's an additional 524 people on supervision over the next in the coming 5 years, I should say. So what were some of the policy options that were developed and presented to the JJC? We provided judges with recidivism outcome data to inform sentencing options, including probation, adult community correction centers, intensive supervision in prison, to focus supervision resources during the initial years of a prison's probation or parole term when risk of recidivism is highest. Use risk assessment results to guide decision-making on supervision levels, case planning, and programming, and allow overrides only when appropriate due to extenuating factors, which we're going to get to in more detail here in a couple minutes. And to prioritize admissions to the adult community correction centers and the intensive supervision program for people on supervision who violate their conditions or who are assessed at being at very high risk of recidivism at the start of their supervision term. So just a few of the different policy options we presented to the JJC. We're going to move into the second challenge here that was facing the state, and that was ineffective and costly supervision strategies. So a few of the problems outlined here, or issues outlined here, I should say, was Wyoming's adult community correction centers were serving a mix of different correctional populations: inmate status, parole, probation. People who start supervision terms at ACCs were recidivating at a higher rate than those who start on standard supervision in the community. People assigned to the intensive supervision program, 60% of whom were low or moderate risk, were failing at significantly higher rates than people on standard supervision. On any given day, 30% of people in prison are incarcerated due to a supervision revocation, leading Wyoming to spend $30 million a year incarcerating people for supervision violations, those technical violations we just reviewed. Wyoming statutes predisposed courts and the parole board to impose lengthy periods of incarceration following supervision revocations, meaning that with incarceration rates for people who violate probation roughly mirroring rates of new incarceration. So the time spent in prison after a violation of their conditions of supervision was the approximate length of time people were being sentenced to prison for a new crime. And again, I really want to focus or draw your attention to this is what we found in 2018. So this is historical perspective here. There have been policies implemented, obviously, and there has been some other policy and procedure changes that have affected some of these numbers now. Supervision resources were not only strained due to the increase in Wyoming's prison supervision population, but because of how many people are placed on probation for low-level offenses. So we were seeing here, you can see that misdemeanor probation made up nearly a quarter of all people on probation in the state. That's a huge strain on resources and on supervision officers that were already in short supply. And then subsequently with the budget reductions the state has gone through would make it a more significant strain on the system.
Question, please. Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Stephanie, when we look at misdemeanor probation, are we unique in having our probation and parole folks supervise misdemeanor caseloads compared to other states? And if we're fairly unique in that respect, what do other states do with misdemeanors? Do they just release them in the community with no supervision, or are there other options?
Stephanie?
Chairman Olson, Representative Washut, thank you very much for the question. It's a great question. The state is not alone in putting people with misdemeanor records on probation. It is actually the amount of people on misdemeanor probation in Wyoming that's putting a strain on it. And so there's a greater number of people being placed on misdemeanor probation than necessarily need to be. They could be fined, sentenced to community supervision. I'll invite David here to add some additional comment or context to that question.
Certainly, absolutely. It is the case that in all states there are people on misdemeanor supervision. What a lot of states have done, though, is developed a variety of responses for people that are on misdemeanor supervision, because what the data shows is that a significant number of those individuals who are at the lower levels of risk, there is literally no impact by supervising them. So by providing other options, whether those are diversionary options, community service options, fines, something called banked caseloads, which means having folks call in every 2 weeks or once a month. Some states use what's called kiosk caseload management for those low risk folks. And so the issue is certainly not that one should ignore misdemeanors, but the issue is how to better disaggregate that group of individuals and to not essentially waste scarce supervision resources on folks where the information shows their rate of failure tends to be so low, we actually can't do anything to improve that.
Thank you, David.
Did you want to follow up? Or no? Okay, Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess, I don't know if it's kind of interrupting where you are, but since we've taken the break, I have to say, to truly open the discussion, I mean, I appreciate the work you do, but I've just heard several times this sort of consternation with people being incarcerated because they're there on a revocation. But I mean, it seems to me that there's either circular logic there or like that's exactly how it works. In the alternative, it would be that they had their sentence imposed originally. The point being, they were given an opportunity at probation. I mean, I don't see how starting out rather than imposing, giving somebody the opportunity at probation isn't the goal. And then whether you're calling it technical, but it's pretty key. We have a lot of it in, I guess I don't, to explain, I'm a prosecutor. So I deal with this a lot, but so, I mean, absconsion, you know, so they get the opportunity, but they're going to be monitored. Then if they refuse to be, or if they continue to with the behavior, then that's why a sentence is imposed. It's not some sort of like, oh, gotcha. You know, I mean, they were originally given the opportunity. That's the point. And then interestingly, conversely, since you said it was about 50% from technical violations, that means 50%, half of the people on probation did new criminal offenses. Yet again, proving that they're not probably appropriate for the community at that time, hence an imposition of sentence. So I guess what I'm opening for discussion or just throwing out there, but I can't see how, you know, this idea that the fact that they were revoked means that, you know, there's a trigger happy probation and parole or criminal justice system, when in reality, they were given an opportunity and it's not working.
Well, Representative Oakley, I think we're going to find out because we're just in the historical data portion, but this is making me already think about the legislation that we did on when we talk about probation duration. And so, but I think, you know, Stephanie, you can certainly respond, but I think if you, once we get through the historical data and you see some of the legislation that we've done to address that, and we still haven't gotten to the phase where we get to see what our changes have done to the data, if any. But Stephanie, I don't know if you want to respond or if we're going to see this in your presentation. I'm not sure how you want to, where you want to take us.
Chairman Olson, Representative Oakley, thank you very much for the question. I'm actually going to tee it over to David because it did look like he had a response queued up for you, Representative Oakley, and then I will follow up from David.
Certainly. Thank you, Chairman Olson, Representative Oakley. So to be clear, the description of technical violations are taken from the way that Wyoming describes them, as opposed to our definition of them. Secondly, you're absolutely correct that there are different types of technical violations depending on what those are. And some of them are technical violations that really the only answer is that makes any sense is to return that individual to prison. One cannot go from a particular number of technical violations and a return to prison to zero. What it becomes is looking at what are the drivers of that, and when are those drivers such that one, community safety is at risk, and if so, you need to respond to that. Or two, are the drivers of that something that can be responded to more effectively rather than sending folks back to prison? Why do we care about that? Well, really two reasons. One is they're going to get out again, and so we'd like to do something to make them safer. Two is the cost, as has been mentioned previously. And so the idea when we look at these issues of technical violations is not to say, first of all, that people are bad because they're there, that the system is bad. That's not the point. Systems do the best they can all of the time with what it is that they have. And so one of the things that you look at is, well, what might be missing in a system, or what kind of resources might make a difference that could impact that? What can you do to lessen the interruption of families? What can you do to lessen the interruption of employment? What can you do to lessen the potential for increased failure down the road for some percentage of those individuals? And that percentage varies from state to state, and it varies depending on how states define what the misdemeanors are, or for that matter, what the felonies are. And so there's not a number, there's not a magic number of, well, it should be at this. But when you look at the drivers of populations in terms of incarceration, you need to look at the drivers of how they get there, and whether they get there from community supervision or whether they get there from new crime. And one of the reasons that one looks at the drivers in terms of technical and then disaggregates them, because there's a difference between whether somebody has a mental health issue that's not able to be treated for some reason and then fails on supervision versus somebody who may have absconded, for example. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all problem, nor is it a one-size-fits-all response, and we would certainly never suggest that. And in fact, as we move forward, I think you'll see that there are different issues, and that in some cases, there are responses that can impact a number of these folks and can be helpful in terms of lowering this. There are also ways to have intermediate sanctions as opposed to just one or the other, meaning only in or out. And then there are some folks where the final answer has to be, yep, they go back. There's no question about that. And so to be clear, we would never suggest that the solution to the problem is simply don't have any technical violations of individuals. It's an issue of disaggregating what they are, making considered determinations about what are the best responses in order to most effectively keep those folks in the community, or if necessary, to remove them from the community.
Thank you, David. I also want to add, alluding to something that Chairman Olson also added in, that we did additional work with the state on the PRISM system, which is the incentives and sanctions structure that is being used by DOC staff to respond to violations in a more graduated way, so that revocation isn't the first solution or the second solution, but trying to understand, as David just explained, some of those other areas or needs that folks have to keep them successful or be successful. I definitely want to leave it open if any other questions or we can keep moving. I will keep moving and definitely will still circle back if there are any. All right. To keep going, almost half of people on probation are bumped up to higher supervision levels upon intake, shifting resources from higher to lower risk people in 2018. Oh, do we need a 10-minute break? Okay, time out. Thank you.
Okay.
They should be able to hear you now.
Now can you hear us?
We can hear you.
All right, let's
Okay.
set a goal. Maybe we don't touch the.
Right. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, Stephanie, David, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
All
Yes,
right.
Chairman, we can hear you.
Apologize out there for anyone watching on YouTube. We had a technical difficulty, but we are back. And what I wanted to say was, David, in response to just to drive it, I think a little more concrete as opposed to speaking in the abstract. I'm thinking of two data points in trying to answer more concrete Representative Oakley's question. And one of those data points you alluded to, which is the underlying mental health or substance use issue. And I think somewhere in here, you're probably going to give us the statistic of how many of our folks inside of our incarceration systems suffer from either or. And then more importantly, how many on the revocation, have a mental health or substance use issue. So that's the first data point. And then the second thing is probation itself. I seem to remember that what we found in Wyoming was that out of all these probations, one of the issues we had was duration in probation, that sentences, probation was being imposed for too lengthy of periods. And what we found a strong correlation that these longer periods resulted in lower success rates. And that if we shortened probation, then we would have higher success rates. And so we statutorily capped some of those in order to try to incentivize that at sentencing. And so maybe you could speak to both of those.
Certainly, Chairman Wilson. In terms of the first one, absolutely. When we get to the next section, we are going to talk specifically about some mental health and substance use issues and some of the challenges and some of the responses that Wyoming has already put into place around this. And so we will get to that very soon. And in terms of the probation issue, once again, yes, what you find are a couple of things. The first one is, as Stephanie already mentioned, when you do have folks who are failing on probation, or the majority of people who fail on probation fail fairly early, which is why one argues for what's called front-loading services and supervision. You want to go out the gate with as much as you can. Where you see the second failure rate tends to be when people are given probation sentences that drag on forever and ever. And basically what happens is that they ultimately end up giving up hope, if you will. And so you'll see people do very well for a period of years, and then you'll see them do a downturn, if you will. And I don't mean new crime. New crime is always a separate issue, and if there's new crime, there's new crime. And that's all there is to it. You respond to that as quickly as possible. But we're talking about, again, that failure rate in terms of technical violations that happen over a long period of time. So one, there's not much cost benefit, because when you see the actual failure rate, you see the majority of those problems are up front, and you can drop those problems if you front load supervision and treatment, as Stephanie, I think, indicated and showed in an earlier slide. And then two, you don't want to either A, waste resources, or B, in essence, help failure occur by hanging on to people for a very long period of time when the data pretty consistently shows that it does not make any improvement. And so you did make those changes. You have not seen a gigantic increase in crime as a result of that. You're still in the early days of that. Let's be very clear. You have at least two more years of data that you need to gather to be able to look at all of this. But the initial numbers, the initial data that's being collected, and the Department of Correction, Department of Health, Department of Mental Health, and our research folks are constantly examining and searching, reviewing the data to put out reports. And we'll have more information about that when we do a report for you all in April or May, depending on when that is. But then ultimately, we'll be reporting data back to you for the next 2 years in terms of looking at the impact of the changes that you've all made.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Olson. So I'll back up just a little bit, repeat my sentence here. Almost half of people on probation were being bumped up to higher supervision levels upon intake, shifting resources from higher to lower risk individuals. There is some greater context that should go into these numbers. Although 47% of the total group appeared to be supervised at a level above their initial risk level, there were some things going into that, especially other assessment tools being completed. So currently, Wyoming uses something called the Compass, which is a generalized risk recidivism tool, to predict future risk of criminal activity. In addition to the Compass, the state was also using things like substance abuse assessments, domestic violence assessments, sex offender assessments, DUI assessments. And so there was some miscommunications around which should be prioritized over others, which if the Compass should take prioritization and assigned supervision level, or if other assessments should be weighted more greatly. And so there was some confusion there. So I don't want anybody to look at these numbers and say 50% of those on felony supervision were assessed as low risk, but only 13 were placed on a low risk supervision level. There was a little bit more going into that than just the gut instincts, let's say, of the supervision officers, but they were still overriding at a higher rate than the research shows you really want to achieve. You want to keep that at a 10% for the risk tool you're using, and then 20 to 30% override for the consideration of additional riders like DUI, DV, domestic violence, sex offender, things like that. All right. Overrides of assessed risk level and referral to treatment without differentiation of risk led to people who are at the lowest risk to recidivate being referred more often to programming. So when we take a look at those who are on supervision, more often those that were at lower risk in behavioral health worlds are kind of thought of as our easier clients. Those are our clients that they show up to group and they do the assigned homework and they don't crosstalk as much and some other things, but those are really good, simple examples. We're being referred at higher rates than those who maybe had higher needs. Those who had more severe substance use addiction, those who had a higher risk to recidivate. So there was a lot going on in the state, especially around overrides and referrals to treatment and things like that. The CSG Justice Center developed and worked with the JJC on some different policy options to address these issues. So revising Wyoming's sanction and incentives matrix to increase the certainty, predictability, and proportionality of responses applied to people on probation and parole. There was work done on imposing short periods of incarceration that include programs addressed to assist risk and needs for people who commit persistent and high level violations and have exhausted appropriate community level sanctions. Suggested and developed reinvestment in evidence-based community programs to reduce recidivism and to prioritize people on probation and parole who will benefit most from the intervention, and prioritization of admission to ACCs and ISPs for people on supervision who violate their conditions or who are assessed at being higher risk to recidivate at the start of their supervision term. Some ways to mitigate that, to take a step, and as David said, to front load some of those services early on. Any questions there?
Committee? All right.
The third challenge facing Wyoming's system was inadequate victim assistance and compensation. So people are accessing the compensation program, but may not be getting all of their eligible expenses reimbursed. Although victims are helped by established providers, the state can grow new programs that reach new victims in rural and frontier areas. And restitution processes are explained in law, but data is really unavailable to understand how it is ordered, collected, dispersed, things like that. one of the original points we made out to the state was the maximum victim compensation benefit at $15,000 being a little bit lower than some of your surrounding states, your neighbor states. But I do want to point out this first bullet here, which is 56 claims in 2016, 2018 between those fiscal years maxed out the $15,000 benefit, but 105 claims exceeded $10,000 in benefits. So this isn't a widespread, everyone is maxing out their benefit here, but it's something to be aware of that a few are. Victims seeking mental health services in the larger population centers are better able to access mental health services than people in our rural areas. Not surprising, and not surprising in any state that has large rural areas. And victims can get reimbursed for travel costs to and from these appointments. So some mix of some areas for improvement and some really good strengths that the state had with the victim compensation program. One of the areas of concern around victim compensation was a little bit about the restitution process, the communication around restitution, how well people were doing at meeting their restitution, making their payments, having victims of crime understand that restitution may not come straight to the victim, but may reimburse the crime victim compensation program is still that person making amends for the crime that they committed by making restitution payments. So some communication issues there around what the state could do to improve, messaging around what programs are available in different areas, and who can access those programs.
Go ahead, Representative Washer has a question.
Thank you. Stephanie, when it comes to victims' compensation benefits, we have a cap at $15,000. Is there sufficient money in the Victims' Compensation Fund to increase that ceiling? Or is it a shortage of revenues into that account that force us to keep the cap at 15,000?
Chairman Olson and Representative Washington, that's a great question. In one of our earlier presentations to the Joint Judiciary Committee, Kara Chambers, who oversees the Crime Victim Compensation Program, responded to a similar question in that she's actually not suggesting that the state raise the max benefit for victim compensation, but rather that there be more work on the restitution side of things to encourage completion of restitution, to make sure that people are receiving adequate communication that they need to pay, that there's a chance for people to be assigned restitution in cases where maybe it's not assigned, to help bolster up the program a little bit more. But she stated herself that she doesn't think that the max benefit actually needs to change. I know that's a little bit different than what your question was. I can't answer a budget question at this moment, but I can definitely look into what we've kind of suggested in the past.
Thank you.
Okay. So to go over the JJC's policy development around victim compensation, the expansion of benefits to allow the program to establish good cause to extend the time limit for accessing improved benefits, and increase the funeral benefit amount, use the needs assessment conducted in partnership with the Office of the Attorney General and the Wyoming Statistical Analysis Center to create funding opportunities to grow new programs and projects for victims in Wyoming, and create processes and procedures for collecting and sharing information about restitution orders, collections, and reimbursement of disbursements. All right, our fourth challenge here, our last one, was the challenge of inadequate substance use treatment system for people interacting with both the criminal justice system and the state's behavioral health system. We're going to move through this one, and then we're going to touch more in depth on the behavioral health side of things with David. But in 2018's biennium, Wyoming appropriated $8 million for substance use disorder treatment in prison, but does not have a system in place to ensure timely access to treatment in the community. Over 10 years, state funding for DOC substance use disorder treatment dropped by 25%, and intensive outpatient treatment was eliminated, resulting in substance use treatment completions falling dramatically. There are also 16 contracted nonprofit community behavioral health providers in the state, and it is estimated that 50 to 70% of people accessing substance use disorder treatment are in the criminal justice system in those community behavioral health providers. And parole violations occur within the first year of supervision on average, raising the importance of having continuity of care in the community. And yet stakeholder reports and data showed delays in getting people into treatment. So again, in 2018, these were some of the things that were facing the behavioral health system in the state. Across all supervision field offices, the majority of the referrals for treatment were substance use disorder related. So you can see here on the right, out of the 100% of the people in each district that needed a substance use referral, you can see the different percentages there that actually received a referral. So it varied anywhere from 42% in District 1 all the way up to 74% in District 3. As a result of funding cuts, substance use disorder treatment completion fell, and completion in prison fell in 2017. So you can see there the distribution of people in prison who were participating in substance use treatment programs, both residential programs, outpatient level care, aftercare, and intensive outpatient level of care within the institution. So that looks a little bit different than it would in the community, but it's just really about the level of care, the intensity of the treatment that they were receiving in prison. So some of those policies that were addressed, to address the behavioral health needs of those in the criminal justice system included expanding the availability of timely evidence-based treatment for people on probation and parole, provide necessary intensity of specialized evidence-based community substance use disorder and or mental health treatment for people on probation and parole, to create a more seamless continuity of care for people transitioning from incarceration to community, and to improve coordination between probation and parole field offices and community mental health and substance use centers by instituting coordinated, collaborative case plans focused on behavior change. So some really strong policy options there for the behavioral health side of the house. To give you some idea of where we've kind of landed during phase 1 of justice reinvestment, it was projected that adoption of justice reinvestment policies could potentially avert 18.1 million by fiscal year 2024. This is a similar graph as to what we saw earlier, but now you're seeing with some of the policy adoptions, what the state might be able to expect with the enactment of those different policies. So we projected that prison populations would fall. That would include being able to bring back out of state prisoners from Kansas and Mississippi, and also to avoid the need to do new construction at Torrington to accommodate the growth of the prison population. So you can see there the projected cost, if nothing had been done and the prison population continued to grow, would have been $51 million. And the source of that, again, is the $21 million for 200 more contracted beds and $30 million for increased capacity to accommodate the growth. Again, really want to stress that these projections were crafted based off of data, based off of DOC simulations and things like that, but they were also done pre-COVID-19 pandemic. And so things are going to change a little bit, just as we've seen in many states across the country. The prison population, supervision population, policy and practice necessarily had to accommodate some of the things that COVID-19 brought. So these projections are pre-COVID. So I really urge keeping that in mind as we keep moving forward. And as you review our next reporting out of what the data looks like for Wyoming. Similarly to the prison population during phase 1 of justice reinvestment, we projected that the adoption of justice reinvestment policies may aid in reducing the projected probation population by approximately 324 people. So in that projection, there is time built in for some of these policies to take effect to impact that growth. So you were going to continue in the state to see the supervision population grow, but after a couple of years, you should start to see it slowly drop as those policies take effect, are implemented and sustained. Again, there's a kind of a caveat here that these are pre-COVID projections. So what did all of this work in phase 1 of the system-wide analysis and policy development phase, what did it result in? It resulted in 4 pieces of legislation being enacted by the legislature and signed into law. SEA 19, which provides additional tools to support judges as they determine probation terms and sentence lengths. SEA 50, which focuses probation resources on people during the initial first year of their probation term when they are at their greatest risk of failing on supervision. HEA 53, which holds people on probation and parole accountable with swift, certain, and proportional sanctions. And HEA 15, which extends the amount of time eligible for victims can receive coverage for mental health services. These pieces of legislation introduced reforms across the system. So here, I'm not going to read all of these out to you guys, but you can see that there were different components of each bill that really touched on different parts of the system, whether that be the courts, your prisons, community behavioral health, victim services. So it was a wide sweeping round of legislation, and it did not end there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions or if we'd like to take a break at all. Otherwise, I will throw it over to David, and he would be able to walk you guys through the work that was done around the behavioral health assessment in the 2019 interim session.
We never take breaks, Stephanie. We're the hardest working team.
It's good to know, Chairman Olson. I'll keep that in mind.
Questions, committee? Representative Provenza.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at the slide where you look at substance use disorder treatment completion in prison falling, and 3 of the 4 pretty dramatically fell in fiscal year 2017. I'm wondering what now we're paying for that. Like, have we seen an uptick in drug offenses? Do we have any ideas to what that ends up costing us maybe in fiscal year 2019? Thanks.
Stephanie?
Chairman Olson, Representative Provenza, thank you for the question. It's a great question. When you do have a reduction in treatment, we do often see the price tag appear somewhere else for that reduction in treatment. I don't have the data with me because that is part of the final presentation that we're preparing for the state, or the final reporting out that we're preparing for the state, where they may have seen the effect of that decrease in funding and therefore decrease in completion rate in prison. There's different possibilities. You could see an increase in the rate of people entering community behavioral health programs once released from prison. That, of course, is going to impact the Department of Health and their funding for those programs. But that's one example. David, in your work with the community behavioral health centers and the behavioral health system in general, can you pinpoint other locations where the state may see an increase in costs due to the decrease in providing funding for prison programming?
So I think the key issue to think about, and first of all, again, all of this was pre-COVID, and so the impact of COVID-19 on everything has just been overwhelming across the country. We're dealing with this with every correctional system in the country. However, as I'm going to get to in just a few slides, when we look at the failure rates of folks on technical violations, not new crime, we find a very high number of those are related to substance use issues. And so in terms of the cost, what happens is that given the failure rate, the cost is pretty high because of the cost of reincarcerating them. And so what's happened inside the prison with those cuts was that certain necessary levels of treatment went away. And one of the problems that you have had, both in the community and in the facilities, is a set of treatment needs not matched by the available services to respond to them. So while we'll have some data, and again, for this presentation, we were asked to give a history as opposed to an update. We have to finish gathering those numbers. We will have this for you as we move forward. What we know is that we can draw a line from this problem to the high technical violation rate. What we can't do right now is draw a line specifically to dollar costs or something like that.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing that.
And so I will talk a little bit about now for a few minutes around the behavioral health assessment. And Stephanie's going to be kind enough to move the slides for me. So if you would move to the next slide, please. What happened was that we weren't able to get everything accomplished during the first part, the first phase one. What happened was that as a result of that, we did sort of a phase 1.5. And during the 2019 legislative interim session, Wyoming moved forward with JR, or Justice Reinvestment, in two other ways. One was the Joint Labor, Health, and Social Services Committee worked with ourselves to continue to study the issues that were facing people in the criminal justice system who have behavioral health needs. And secondly, the state requested that the United States Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance, support us to continue providing technical assistance to Wyoming in order to implement the policy changes that were developed in phase one, initiating what is called phase two of the state's justice reinvestment process. And that's what we have been working with the state on for the last couple of years. And so we'll talk about that a little bit further in the next section, but let me give you a little bit more information in terms of the behavioral health pieces. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So this just gives you the timeline. In February of 2019, there was the interim session request to continue the assessment of the behavioral health system. And then beginning in May, started site visits to community behavioral health agencies and conducted qualitative assessments. That was myself doing that, along with two other colleagues that joined me at different periods of time. I have had the good fortune to visit at this point every corner of Wyoming and have spent a lot of time on the Route 80 corridor, if you will, going from one part of the state to the other and also going north to south as well. And what we did in those meetings was meet with a significant number of folks, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Then in June of 2019, we provided some of our first findings on the behavioral health system to the Joint Committee, and we gave them both the analysis that was completed in 18 and then the analysis from the initial site visits. And then we gave them a final report in September of 19, made some policy recommendations, and then in March of 2020, HEA 62 was enacted. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So as part of that work, we collaborated with both the Department of Correction and the Department of Health to analyze the overlap between the supervision population and the population of folks that were accessing treatment. And we looked at 4 areas: the proportion of folks that had known behavioral health needs that are in the criminal justice system, who are accessing services through the community mental health and substance use centers, the proportion of people accessing centers in Wyoming who are on supervision, the difference in cost or volume of services between people who are and are not on supervision, and the benefits of investing in treatment in terms of reducing returns to prison. Next slide, please. So what we did, as I mentioned, is that we did a lot of traveling. We went to all of these different places that you see in the state. We held 12 focus groups of folks on supervision who had been flagged with a behavioral health need. So that was 87 individuals, 50 males, 37 females. We held 3 focus groups of individuals who were incarcerated, who had a behavioral health need, who had been recently revoked. And so 18 of those, 18 folks that were revoked to prison, 8 of those were men, 10 of those were women. And we also engaged with the behavioral health providers and the community stakeholders across the state, visited 14 different providers, and had approximately 66 stakeholders that participated in various focus groups or one-on-one conversations. And so we wanted to get a picture, and we wanted to get a picture statewide because, of course, the issues are not the same everywhere in the state. What we found was that slightly more than half of the people at that time who were on supervision had a known and with a known need were accessing services at community behavioral health centers. In other words, a lot of folks who were on supervision had behavioral health needs and indeed were accessing services. Now, there was a wide variation in the percentage of people who were accessing services depending on where in the state. And so when you look at the different districts, and these were the DOC districts, when you look at the different ones, in some places you had a high percentage of individuals that were accessing, the highest being 80%. And in some cases, it was much lower, with the lowest being 38%. Now, to be clear, there are multiple reasons for that. And there's not one answer to this. In some cases, that had to do simply with whether or not services were available or the necessary services were available in that area. And in some cases, it had to do with the distance and in addition to other problems that could get in the way. So when we talk about this issue of the differences in accessing, this is not an issue of a good district or a bad district. That's not what the point is here at all. The issue is that high number of individuals with behavioral health needs, inconsistency in terms of access to services and accessing services depending on where it is that you are looking in the state. Next slide, please. What we saw also was that people on supervision with a behavioral health need were experiencing delays in accessing treatment at community behavioral health centers, regardless of their level of risk. And when I say their level of risk, what we mean is the risk and needs assessment that determines risk of recidivism. And what we found was that there were a significant number of individuals, like over half, that it was over a month before they were accessing services. What we know is that, quite frankly, people need to access services as soon as possible upon release. Quite frankly, within 72 hours would be the ideal, but certainly within a week. And what we saw was that this was not happening in many parts. Now, again, there were numerous reasons for why this could have been the case, and it wasn't the same everywhere. In some cases, it may have been a delayed referral by an agent, but there were multiple other reasons. Wait lists at centers. Centers have been overwhelmed in many parts of the state. They may have been accessing services at a private provider. And so they were choosing, the client was choosing to go to one place versus another, and therefore there was a time difference in terms of that. The client may have simply been a difficult client and they just did not show, or they may have actually been revoked prior to the appointment, particularly those folks where it was a long period of time. And not surprisingly, I'm sure to any of you, transportation issues were a major part, particularly in those parts of the state that are more rural or frontier parts of the state. So multiple reasons why that happened. It's not an issue of blame about any of that. It's an issue of the problem is when that happens, your failure rate increases, your revocation rates increase, your prison population rates increase. Next slide, please. What we also found was that high-risk folks that were on supervision who did access mental health and substance use disorder services were successful in the community for a longer period of time, what technically is called a survival curve. High-risk clients who receive mental health and substance use disorder services remained in the community for almost a year on average longer. And so the time to failure model, if you will, shows that there is an impact. And you think of the cost of providing services, if you will, versus the cost of housing those individuals for that period of time. And you can see a significant difference in what those costs are, not to mention in the negative impact, in addition to the negative impact for the community or the negative impact for the individual. Yes, Chairman Olson.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I got a question here from Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question in regards to assessing their risk level. You said they base it on the risk of recidivism as far as getting access to care in that delay period. How about people that need medication? I know that some rely on community mental health centers to prescribe their medication. Is there any slides that speak in the future that speak to a delayed access to psychiatric meds in this component?
We do not have, we were not able to get data to be specific about access to psychiatric meds. What I would tell you is that obviously if we have a large number of people who are delayed in accessing care at the mental health center, then those people who need medication are also being delayed in terms of medication. But the ability to access that granular data, that granularity of data in terms of which individuals are receiving medication versus not, is not something that we had access to in doing any of this analysis. That would be, frankly, I don't even know if you have the data that you can extract, but if anybody does, it would be data collected probably by your Department of Health, and that would certainly be protected data that we would not have access to. Next slide. So what we found and what we presented to the Joint Committee were some key findings. One was that there were variations in the cost of treatment across the state, that the eligibility term or the amount of time allowed to meet the sliding fee scale was different, that in some cases the sliding fee scale itself was different, and that there were inconsistencies in the qualifications for payment plan eligibility. Over half of the folks that were reentering the community from prison were waiting more than a month, as I mentioned, to access behavioral health treatment in the community. Level of care recommendations were varying among assessors. So one type of assessment is that risk and need assessment that was just being asked about. And to be clear, that risk is what's the risk of recidivism. That's all that is. What's the likelihood of this person failing without intervention as we move forward? Additional assessment includes substance use or mental health assessment, to use those two in this case. And one of the ways that substance use assessment is done in Wyoming is through the use of the ASI, or the Addiction Severity Index. What we found at that time was that in many cases there were repetitive evaluations done, sometimes at significant cost to the individual, and that one of the delays that got created was that they could not get into treatment unless they completed the ASI, but they didn't have the money to complete the ASI, and so that treatment got pushed out. So that was another reason and another problem. The second problem that we saw was that in many cases, there wasn't necessarily a reason to have that replicated because there were no significant differences in their life events. And then the third issue that we saw were differences among the recommendations. In other words, even with no significant life event differences between the differences, the result of one ASI might say this person needs one level of care. The result of another one might say they need another level of care. Now, to be clear, in some cases, somebody may need a level of care that does not exist where they live. And the best you can do is provide them with what exists. No argument about that. However, the recommendation or the result of the assessment should not vary. It should be a statement that says this person needs X level of care. This does not exist in this part of the state. Therefore, what we are doing is this as a way to be able to provide the best we can, as opposed to getting 3 ASIs with 3 different levels of care on the same individual.
David?
And yes.
Yeah, this is Art Washer. Just a quick question on, we heard during the COVID situation, some discussion about telehealth. And I'm
Yes.
just wondering if you have comment whether offenders who receive substance abuse, behavioral health services over a Zoom or some type of telehealth module, if that's equally effective.
Representative Washit, I don't know that I can say that it is equally effective. I don't know that we have that solid data. We have data that shows that it is effective. In other words, it's not an either or. What we have found in terms of telehealth for both substance use and mental health is that it is effective in lowering the failure rate of those individuals. I don't know that there's been a direct comparison study of A to B, but it is valid to use telehealth. It is particularly valid or particularly important in states like Wyoming, where in some cases, somebody would have to travel 2 or 3 or 4 hours to get to somewhere. Part of the difference becomes what that person's need is. In other words, telehealth is not going to resolve a problem if somebody needs residential care. But if somebody needs outpatient services of some sort or another, telehealth can be very effective in doing that. Not only that, but we have found that using computer assessments, the computerized, for example, assessment of the addiction severity index, we've actually found it to be in many cases more accurate than it being done in a pencil and paper way. That, interestingly enough, people tend to be more honest when they're responding to the computer than when they are responding to another individual. So we strongly support telehealth. We recommended that telehealth be something that be continued and expanded in Wyoming, and it is indeed effective. But I cannot tell you directly, one-to-one, what the difference is in terms of outcomes. We just don't have data on that at this point. Last item is, whoops, back one more, please, Steph. The last item on there was the issue of the timeliness of assessment being shared to community providers, and that was creating a barrier. There were actually 2 issues. One was there were some problems with DOC getting that out in a timely fashion. And when I say DOC, I mean the providers at DOC. And then there were some problems with the community providers accepting the assessments and wanting to do their own. I need to say that DOC, Department of Health, and the providers have been working tirelessly over the last year in improving these areas. And we'll talk more about this when we do a final presentation, but I have been massively impressed with the work that the agencies and the community providers have been doing under very difficult circumstances. And not only that, despite the fact that, like in every state, there are things that can be improved, you have some of the most knowledgeable providers that I have seen, and I've been doing this for 40 years. You have some of the most knowledgeable providers I've seen in terms of working with this population. Wyoming has a lot of challenges, as does every state, but Wyoming has a lot of things to be really proud about in terms of the work that its folks are doing. Steph, next slide again, please. So as a result of that assessment, that follow-up assessment, the legislature passed House Enrolled Act 62 in March of 2020, which requires the Department of Correction and the Department of Health to increase collaborative efforts. Because one of the things, again, that we were seeing is you have so many folks in your system, in your criminal justice system, with behavioral health issues, that expecting that DOC can solve that by itself, no matter what they have, is just not going to work. It really has to be a collaborative effort. You really need the Department of Health and the Department of Correction to be working together. And to be clear, we're not suggesting that they weren't doing that, but we were suggesting ways to increase that collaboration. One was by improving the quality and accuracy of substance use assessments through the creation of a quality improvement unit in the Department of Corrections. That was actually in the bill and was ordered. There was funding for it. It was to be staffed by 3 individuals. Again, due to fiscal crises, there were cuts to the budget. That unit does exist. There is currently only one individual in that unit, but it is off the ground. It is getting started, which is extremely important when we talk about these issues of there being different assessment outcomes and those kinds of things. Secondly, to create a behavioral health services enhancement program for community providers to improve outcomes for people in the criminal justice system. Third, to adopt standardized evidence-based treatment practices and guidelines for treating and providing programming to people in the criminal justice system with behavioral health needs. As to the second one, let me just mention that while folks are working on that, again, COVID came, again, there are significant funding concerns. And so I think the degree to which it was originally envisioned that some of these things could be done, they're on hold or they're only partially done until things get better, if you will, so things improve from a fiscal perspective. But the third one, through the subaward, we were able to provide folks with that training. And so there have been statewide trainings that have been collaborative trainings between the Department of Health, the Department of Corrections, and the community providers, looking at both what's the appropriate programming for correctional clients, as well as training on ASAM, Addiction Society, the American Society for Addiction Medicine. Sorry, I'm going too quickly here. In terms of getting everybody on the same page, as well as ASI training, the Addiction Severity Index training. The idea being that, again, you've got a lot of good folks, but let's have everybody speaking the same language. Let's have everybody working from the same playbook, if you will, and make certain that when somebody is going from one part of the system to another, that there is a consistency and a coherency, regardless of what part of the system that they're in. And then last but not least, at that point, there was in the bill,
Mr.
creating
DeMora?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're having technical problems in the committee room,
Oh.
which is why you don't see the room up on the Zoom. We have IT there working on it right now, so you may want to pause until they come back online.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you for the update.
It's gonna come back up.
Oh.
Hey, David, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
We can hear you.
Sorry, we lost it on our end, but we're all good. You're doing a good job.
Are you back?
Chairman
online?
Olson, Chairman Olson, what was the last piece that you guys were able to hear in the committee room?
When you introduced yourselves? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, thank goodness you have a copy of the presentation then.
We do, yep. And it doesn't look like it's just our, before it was our visual, this time it was just our audio in our room. So everything looked like you were still being recorded. So I think that the YouTube stream is still going to be complete, which is great for the folks out watching, and our members can always go back. So you don't have to go back. You can just keep moving forward, and we can always go back to the stream, I think.
Well, and
Great.
in fact, I was just wrapping my section and was basically saying that here were the 4 things that the committee passed at that, or the legislature passed at that time. And that indeed folks are working on different pieces of this. We'll have more to talk about with that next month or the month after when we talk with you again. And the other thing that I said that I just want to reiterate is that folks, I've been massively impressed by how hard folks are working at this and their commitment to it. both in health and in corrections, and also with the community providers. It has been a pleasure working with them over these last couple of years, and I cannot say that enough. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, David. I want to echo David here. The work that has been done on HEA 62 by both the Department of Corrections, their contracted providers, the Department of Health, and their contracted community behavioral health providers is phenomenal, along with the Wyoming Association of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Centers, their executive director. They have formed an incredible team that is tackling some of the most pressing issues in the state. So it is very exciting to have seen them work, to see them planning out the future of their work. We are constantly saying how sad we are to actually have to leave the state, but we'll be definitely checking in on that because it's phenomenal what they're doing. This last piece here is the implementation of justice reinvestment policies. So this timeline, as you can see, is a little bit expanded out. So we're going back to 2019, when the state actually submitted a request for justice reinvestment technical assistance phase for implementation work. So the state received that. Pieces of legislation of HEA 53 and 15, SEA 50 and 19 were passed and made effective. And then June in 2019, we started up the deliverables for the implementation phase of justice reinvestment. And that included the starting process of delivering core correctional practice training, reworking and training on the new incentives and sanctions structure. Let me reiterate, there was one in place, but this one was revamped and new training was provided on it, which was great. As David covered, in March of 2020, HE 62 was enacted, and implementation activities quickly began in April. Even before the act fully took effect, we were already holding meetings and talking with our implementation team there in the state, which is comprised of DOC, DOH, community, institutional providers. And then you can see as we moved through, although activities were taking place, some of those things were trainings, meetings, policy and procedure revising, but some of those big hit items was the DOC was able to hire their quality assurance manager to fulfill the duties required by HEA 62. So although that bill was initially passed with 3 positions, as David said, but I'm not quite sure you might have heard, it was reduced due to budget restrictions and budget reductions to 1 person, but that position has been filled. DOH and DOC went through their ASAM criteria training along with contracted providers from both agencies. And then really excitingly, a leadership group across the state has formed between DOC, DOH, WAMSAC, and the providers. They went through a leadership and cultural acumen training with a subcontractor through the sub-award process, and really formed a really good, strong communication process and collaborating on how to keep moving the state forward with the behavioral health changes. And then here in March, we've almost completed. Next week will be our final session of a training with nearly 100 stakeholders across the state on a structured decision-making tool to improve consistency in the use of assessments and treatment matching, both in the institutions and in the community. So really good work there. I do want to mention as well that the state has been working on things on a couple of projects on their own, driven by DOC and DOH, to improve the communication line between the institutions and the community providers that we didn't even need to get involved with at all, that they recognized and addressed all on their own and are continuing to. So really exciting work there. This is a shot of the letter that was submitted in February of 2019, making that formal request for technical assistance for the implementation phase of justice reinvestment. Of course, it was awarded. So we've done 2 main types of technical support for Wyoming through the second phase, technical assistance and a agreed upon data monitoring process that, as David alluded to, will continue for 2 years after this phase ends here in March. And so Angie Gunter will be coordinating that with the state, with Mr. Harris from the Department of Corrections. And they've got a really good system already in place. They're communicating well, being able to send data back and forth to each other. Additional funding from BJA and distributed by the CSG Justice Center included $220,000 in non-competitive grant funding to remove barriers to implementation. That included things like, actually, I'll cover that in just a second, but included some exciting things. During phase 2, CSG's Justice Center staff provide targeted support on specific projects through research, lessons learned from other states, assistance to help states establish performance measures, improve data collection and monitor outcomes, and engage stakeholders. So hopefully through that timeline I just reviewed, you can see those different components coming through.
Stephanie, this
Yes.
is Washington again. It's entirely likely that we're going to see an influx of additional COVID CARES Act funding coming to the state. If you all have any recommendations about things that might be COVID related that you have identified in Wyoming, or maybe any other states have identified that are related to this topic, if you could email any suggestions for us, because we're going to be appropriating those funds whenever they might become available. And if you had some suggestions, I'd find that valuable.
Chairman Olson, Representative Washington, that's a great question. CSG Justice Center has been doing a lot of work to actually help states across the country identify how they can respond to COVID in an effective way, especially with all of the changes it brought both within our institutions and our community supervision, the way behavioral health is done. So we can definitely pass on some of the work CSG has done to help states adjust and change policy and procedure to accommodate COVID. And we can, I'll throw it to David because he came back on video here. So he might have some addition that he might want to add. But we definitely have some resources we can share with you.
I was simply going to mirror exactly what you were saying. So.
Great question. I'm happy to hear that you guys will be getting that, hopefully in the very near future. CSG Justice Center staff have worked with Wyoming stakeholders to identify key metrics. So that's our state monitoring process to really the process is we collect that data, we analyze the trends, and then we communicate it back to the state so the state can continue to grow, to adjust, to improve their outcomes. So if we see that there has been something that's happened, maybe something has deteriorated over time, staffing changes, things like that. A lot can happen, budget changes. The state can be made aware of them and adjust accordingly. So I previously mentioned the $220,000 in non-competitive grants that came through from BJA and administered by CSG Justice Center. And we did a lot with that money. So we provided and by we I mean the state. I've been so in the state so long now that I'm referring to me as part of Wyoming. But DOC was able to contract with the University of Cincinnati to train correctional professionals on core correctional practices.
Hey, Stephanie,
yeah,
you don't have to leave Wyoming.
I'm telling you, I enjoy every conversation I have in Wyoming so much that it's gonna be really hard to leave, but I've been told by DOC that I'm not gonna get away too easily. So hopefully I'll be able to stick around some. But that core correctional practices training was a real opportunity for supervision officers to learn some new skill sets when they're meeting with their clients, especially when their clients are doing really well, when their clients may need some intervention, a really great opportunity for them. Training staff on quality assurance, implementation, and fidelity. So that's clearly something that we're doing now in our technical assistance around HEA 62. Training mental health providers, prison substance use professionals, clinicians, community providers, Department of Health staff, DOC staff on the American Society of Addiction Medicine ASAM criteria for individuals with addiction and co-occurring conditions. We just wrapped up the second training there. So 80 professionals were able to participate in that training across the state, heard great reviews from people. In fact, a lot of people have voiced that they would love to have that as an annual booster. And so that's definitely something the state could look into, WAMSAT could help look into, but turned out to be a great training opportunity. Procuring online assessment tools, so the Addiction Severity Index multimedia version. It was purchased through the sub-award and contracted through DOC, but will give free ASI assessments, a package of 4,000 of them, accessible by contracted institutional and community providers, which is a huge resource for the state, for those providers, and really able to make QA processes easier and to improve consistency across the state. So a really valuable add there.
As well as, I just want to add one thing. And the other thing that it does is for those delays that were the result of the individual not having the money, and for those problems, this will help resolve that problem so that it should, in a number of cases, drop that delay of access or entry into treatment.
Absolutely.
Hey, Stephanie, we're nearing our bewitching hour.
Yes.
In the next 5 slides, can you distill them to us in 2 minutes?
I can actually, definitely. So some other activities were delivered, but you guys can read them there. That will help some of that implementation work. I'm not going to read these out to you guys because you can take a look at them yourselves and see all of the implementation activities that have been done across those 4 additional pieces of legislation. Most of that implementation work is done for those pieces. Some things were delayed, like finishing out the CCP training. There was COVID delays with a pause from the University of Cincinnati in training and then getting back on calendars and things like that. But a lot of those activities are firmly in place. And so over the next 2 years, we'll really be able to see the data differences. Here in HEA 62, I'm not going to read these to you guys, but you'll be able to see our technical assistance is really focused on 4 main areas. I do want to point out there are a couple of areas in that bill that were not the focus of technical assistance, and those were around contracting changes or outcome-based funding or anything like that, mainly because all of that was put on pause as the state dealt with the budget issues it was facing. And so we focused our efforts somewhere else. And I think to good outcomes. So to meet the requirements of HEA 62, here are some of the goals that the state kind of put forth and some of the really specific things that CSG Justice Center has completed in partnership with some of our subcontractors. So you've already heard about the ASAM training that was conducted by Train for Change, a great organization that does that ASAM training across the country. And we've also partnered with Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation, ACJI, a group out of Colorado, who has really spearheaded the leadership and culture acumen trainings, the structured decision-making tool training, and really helped the state in figuring out what these QA processes will look like for their quality assurance manager and things like that. So a great partner there. And that brings us to our next step, which won't be hard to summarize since it is 1 slide. But here at the end of the month, our technical assistance wraps up in Wyoming. After that assistance is completed, we would love to be back in touch. There's different ways that we can do that. It can be a reporting out of what we found in the data in this first year and a half of implementation. It can be a reporting out to you on a visit later on in the year when you're back in session, because I know scheduling is very tight as you wrap up here at the end of the month. So we definitely would love to communicate that to you though. So we'll definitely keep in touch about that. And that wraps us up for the day.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Stephanie and David. And to your last point, we will, this is the House Judiciary Committee, and what we're going to need to do is work with our Senate counterpart to try to get this. I think what would be great is to have your presentation on our interim topic list, so that it would be a joint judiciary presentation, and, then we can take a day and really go through all of your conclusions and recommendations, and see if there's anything that we can do over the interim to try to continue to move the ball forward. So that I know you'll be wrapping up here soon, but we probably won't be to the interim until closer to June. But we will stay in touch, and I will bring Senator Nethercott into the loop there, and hopefully we can get that scheduled.
Well, Chairman Olson, that's great news. It is what I was anticipating. We are still going to provide you guys with our report early on, probably in April, mid-April sometime. And then that way you guys will also have a chance to review it, digest it a little bit, so we can make a really good use out of that probably virtual visit during the interim session.
Excellent. That sounds great. I really appreciate you presenting with us today. Appreciate all the work you've put in over the years, and obviously we'll be meeting again. So thank you.
Definitely.
and
Thank you all very
for your
much.
time.
And sorry, this question's for LSO. Is Director Shannon out there?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, would you like me to admit Director Shannon?
Yeah, just for a minute, if you would, please. Director Shannon? Hi, Director Shannon. I knew you were out there, so I wanted to admit you. Obviously we're going to bring this back up, and we'd love to hear from you. Unfortunately, we're going back in to session here in just a few minutes, but I'm sure you'd have a lot to say, and hopefully during the interim we can continue this conversation.
Chairman Olson, committee members, my name is Dan Shannon, Director for the Department of Corrections. I'm here for several purposes today that I just said by. One was to pay respect to the committee and answer any questions that I may. Two is to learn, as many of you have today. I really appreciate the work that David and Stephanie have done through the years. And for the new members, what I'd really like to come across is that it's easy to select the low-hanging fruit. It's easy to look at a certain point and say, this is our issue. The volume of work that's been completed over the last 2 years, as well as the collaboration, is extremely important to move us forward to accomplish our goal and to slow down the rate of incarceration in Wyoming. Chairman, with your permission, I'll just take one more moment. I'll answer some of the loose questions, I think, from Representative Washit. He questioned on technical violations. Most of them are substance abuse related. Ms. Oakley questioned about absconsions. That is a big part of our misdemeanors. Representative Provenza talked about the cuts, and I just wanted to reassure her after the cuts in 17, even with the drastic tier 2 and tier 3 cuts presented for this budget session, that we did not take any money out of our substance abuse. And lastly, to Representative Williams, we provide 30 days of medication, and as well as our reentry team follows up with the client as well as the service provider in the community. Mr. Olson, Chairman Olson, I stand for questions.
Committee, any questions for Director Shannon? No questions at this time, but we really appreciate you answering those questions for us, Director Shannon, and I know we'll be continuing the conversation. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the fruit that we pick from the tree, and this committee's got a lot of energy, so I don't imagine this committee's just going to pick the low-hanging fruit for you.
No. As do I, Chairman. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Director Shannon.
Thank you.
All right, folks, and with that, we will close out our meeting and we'll reconvene on Monday.